Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Raman, and we're going to be looking at carrying forward with we left with our last session on sustainable logistics management. So today I'm looking at covering the learning outcome 2, and what as always is in order for us to cover this learning outcome and the assessment criteria, I've got a few set of slides that I want to be looking at, and also along with that, what I've done is we will look at one or two videos which actually explain the concept of reverse logistics or return logistics as we see. Now, just before I get into the session, what I'm going to be looking at doing is obviously covering the key terminology, which is to look at key terms, key concepts, and models or frameworks required to be covered within the learning outcome 2. So let's start with in particular. Before I start the session off by covering some of the key terminology, what you do is obviously play one or two short YouTube videos, which I think are quite related to the topic that we are going to cover today, and they will allow us nicely to set the basically allow me to nicely set and get into the session by covering some of these concepts related to learning outcome 2, which is understand the concept of reverse logistics practices by using these two YouTube videos. So let's look at playing the first one, which I'm going to do in a second, and this would really explain the concept of what is reverse logistics, why this is now used and important for a lot of organizations in today's world.
Hello class, can I explain any supply chain concepts?
Professor Siegfried, what is reverse logistics?
Well, Sue, reverse logistics is the process of planning, implementing, and controlling the efficient, cost-effective flow of raw materials in process inventory, finished goods and related information, point of consumption to avoid for the purpose of recapturing value or proper disposal.
Professor, can you give an example of reverse logistics?
Let's look at an example. A manufacturer produces product which moves through supply chain network to the distributor or customer. In the process or management after the sale of product alpha involves reverse logistics. If product alpha happened to be defective, the customer would return the product. The manufacturing firm would then have to organize shipping of defective product, testing the product, dismantling, repairing, recycling, or disposing the product. Product alpha will travel and reverse the supply chain network and retain any use from the defective product. This is what reverse logistics is about.
Thanks, Professor, for explaining reverse logistics.
So this gives you a bit of an idea in terms of, what is reverse logistics. Sometimes this term is also, we use another term. We talk about forward logistics and we talk about reverse logistics. So forward logistics is all about when the goods and delivery is happening from onwards of the manufacturer customer. Any sort of activities which come in within the delivery, transportation, packaging, and the goods being sent to the customer would be termed as forward logistics. But at some stage, when we look at the process returns, when we look at something coming back from the customer for repairs or returns or an exchange, would essentially, constitute the concept of something called reverse logistics. Now, there is another short video. It's not a short video, but there's another video which I would, expect you to look at. And this is something that I'm going to include a link of within the presentation slide, because this video talks about, the concept of reverse logistics and why is it very important for Amazon. So in one of the assessment criteria of this learning outcome that we're going to look at today, it'll talk about, the aspects of implementing reverse logistics in different business sectors. Now, one of the business sectors could be e-commerce, and from a perspective of e-commerce and Amazon as an example, this is a very good case for us to look at in terms of understanding why reverse logistics is important, for a company like Amazon. So this particular video will cover towards the later half of our discussion, but for now we will get on with some of the PowerPoint slides to understand the learning outcome in a bit more detail, along with covering some of the key terminology related to this particular learning outcome. So just to recap, I think I want to look at going into not going into the basics, but just generally when we talk about logistics, there are 4 different types of logistics that we have studied in different units that we've covered for this particular course. Now, the different types of logistics can include logistics for supply, distribution, production, and today what we're going to be looking at is the topic of reverse logistics. Now, as was explained in the video, the definition of reverse logistics is something which covers all aspects of the operational areas wherein there is either a reuse of the product or there is a movement of this product or any sort of service also to a certain extent, wherein the final destination is for the purpose of capturing value or for proper disposal. Now, in some cases, we'll also refer to it through recycling, but when we look at this happening from a point of view of a defective product coming back to the retailer or to the manufacturer, here they are looking at disposing that off in a way where they're able to recover some marginal or residual value from that product. And this particular concept is going to be called reverse logistics. Now, in most cases, this tends to happen when we receive or when we see goods actually coming back from the customer, either to the distributor, a warehouse, or a distribution center, or in final terms, going back to the manufacturer or the producer who's produced that good. Now, it is important for us to understand, and there are some key questions which will come to your mind when we talk about this concept of reverse logistics. So some of these questions would include things like, why is there a reverse flow involved at all in supply chain management or in logistics? So sometimes when we look at the flow which happens from customer to the manufacturer, when sometimes goods are returned from the customer to the vendor, manufacturer, distributor, retailer, whatever you call it, that involves a process or a reverse process, let's put it this way. And that reverse process, when it looks at getting or capturing value in terms of either residual or disposal value from the set of products or services which is coming back from the customer, would basically be the definition of something called reverse supply chain, or something which is flowing from the customer back to the manufacturer, and that is a bit of a reverse, and that is why this is also referred to as something called reverse supply chain or reverse logistics. Now, reverse logistics, reverse supply chain, sometimes these terms can be used interchangeably, and they all refer to the processes associated with managing products which are at a final stage. That means they are basically going from the manufacturer to the retailer and onwards to the customer. But in some cases, when these products essentially require repair, replacement, or they are covered under the warranty guarantee side of the clauses when a manufacturer sells these products, then in those cases, there is a reverse flow of these products and services which happens. That means it follows from customer through a process of returns, and it involves the same process, which would mean that the customer would actually, if you visualize, a customer has bought a product from Amazon, it's got delivered, but the product is defective. So the customer is then looking at returning the product. So if they return the product, online, it generates a barcode or a label which needs to be printed, attached to the product itself. It is either collected or the customer is asked to deliver to a particular location. From there, it goes to a warehouse or a collection center. From the collection center onwards to the manufacturer, where the manufacturing or the production team, somebody in that department will look at picking up the product, look at diagnosing the fault, and then once the fault has been repaired or has been replaced, the faulty part has been replaced, again that process follows wherein the product is repackaged, sent onwards from the manufacturer to the distributor. It involves transportation from there onwards to a distribution center, finally to back to the customer. Now, why do you think, one of the other questions which comes to my mind is, why do you think companies use reverse logistics, and what are some examples of companies that we can think of which use actually reverse logistics? So when you look at some of the cases wherein customers are invited to look at buyback schemes, for example, exchange schemes of products. So sometimes, all of us use smartphones, and one company which comes to mind is Apple. So when they launch a new product, they also initiate a program wherein they are looking at buying back some of your old iPhones or iPads or, MacBooks and things, or they're looking at you getting some exchange value or value in exchange for a product that you're trading in, which is an old product for a new product that you're buying from the store. So in this case, the company is actually looking at reverse logistics, because in this case, they're looking at taking back the old product from you, from which they will realize some value or a residual value, and from then on, this value, they will realize in the product either will be recycled, so the components and other bits which can be, salvaged from the product would be done in order to create some residual value, on which they will make some revenue or book some profit, and then that product is disposed of. So when you look at this, sometimes companies have to look at the process of logistics, and we see that currently happening with a lot of consumer companies, and one of such companies is, say, for example, Apple. Now, in order to understand, there are in this process of reverse logistics, there is a model which is called the 5R model of reverse logistics. Now, when we look at this particular 5R model, it basically consists of looking at understanding that the products at some stage would go through in the logistics system, go through wherein the flow would be reversed from the manufacturer to the customer. It will be from the customer to the manufacturer. So when you look at this particular model, this is called the 5R model of reverse logistics, and in this basically you look at returns and exchange, which is the first step, and that is where actually the whole process of reverse logistics actually initiates. At some stage, when these products return back to the producer or the manufacturer, they then take a decision whether it can be salvaged, it can be repaired, is there a part replacement possible, and at some stage, they then look at the process in the system in the background. The process of reselling the return products also start. There is a term that we get to use, especially from a retailer's or from a wholesaler or from a customer perspective, which is called pristine product or non-pristine product. So in developed countries, when we look at our third world developed countries, when we look at in particular, you will see that there is a consumer law which allows customers to be able to return product without any questions being asked for a period of 14 days. So there's a return, period allowed in which the customer has the option to change its mind, and obviously still come back and return the product even if the product has been opened or used. There are certain categories in which these returns are not allowed, and they could be personal wearable products or products which are related to personal hygiene, and those or cosmetics, and those products are not allowed for reversal or basically a return within the 14-day. So at some stage, what you will generally get to see is that this particular process, for some reason, looks at from a company's perspective, the process of essentially reselling the return product now, which has become non-pristine. That means it's been opened, it's been sold once, it cannot be sold again as brand new, and that process of reselling the return products somehow starts within the whole concept of reverse logistics when the company applies it throughout the organization. The third step tends to be repairs. So if the product is under warranty, some sort of a warranty is associated with the product, at some stage the companies would look at offering repairs or replacements for those products, and those then are basically tending to be covered under the repair part, which is the third R. Then you have recycling. That means at some stage the products cannot be salvaged, repaired, or parts could be replaced. In this case, if they are under warranty, the company is obliged to offer a replacement product, and in some cases, the old product which has been exchanged, bought in exchange, or in terms has had an exchange because of certain reasons, is to be recycled. And in those cases, what will happen is you will see that the company will salvage anything which could be salvaged from that product in terms of creating some sort of or realizing some sort of residual value, and this then allows them to look at the fifth R, which is basically recycling and disposal. So this particular concept of reverse logistics, we talk about this, the model of the 5 R's, is that we need to understand. So it starts off with return, recalls, there is some part of it which is recycling, and then also, in some cases when we look at, replacements. Now, there are some advantages and why the companies are looking at reverse logistics. This is something which will come up a bit later, but I put one slide here on this for us to be able to understand that why do companies see value in terms of now considering reverse logistics. Now, this is a process for non-existence in the 1960s. It slowly and gradually gained prominence, and this prominence has primarily happened, in the 1980s, 1990s. So what would happen in this case would be that companies, in order to realize value, in order to look at meeting goals under sustainable, development, under corporate social responsibility, I have now started to look into the concept of reverse logistics, which means that at some stage, whatever they are producing has some resources and raw material into it, and if they can realize some residual value, some sort of value by using this process, which tends to be, anywhere between 9 to 15% in some industrial sectors, and there is some sort of a research which has been done by the ATHE study group. Basically, talks about that in the case of companies which are essentially looking at building a brand and provide customer experience by selling, some sort of a customer experience by selling their products and services. It has been, researched, and then research has revealed this, that on an average, a manufacturer spends between 9 to 15% of their revenues on returns. With the technology now available, wherein a lot of buying is happening online because of the e-commerce side of transaction, which is now available with customers in most countries, what tends to happen is that the rate of returns, which used to be happening in the early 60s, 70s, and 90s, primarily happening because of faults occurring, are now happening because of the reasons, that there is a lot of choice available to customers. And if you look at any industry, any sector, because of this choice, there is a process that the manufacturer, producer has to look into in order to manage returns. So a lot of high-tech businesses in particular can significantly, they can realize, a lot of benefits in terms of short-term and long-term benefits if they look at the process of reverse logistics and implement this within the organization. So here, the idea primarily is if there are products which are sold and those products at some stage under the Consumer Right Acts are returned because the consumer has the option to change his mind, then the refund has to be offered. And in those cases, when those products are to be, disposed of, in the earlier days, companies didn't have this option, so they were not looking at disposing. But now, if they have to dispose of, they can be sold at a cheaper price, wherein the company still sells them as non-pristine products, but is able to realize some margin or revenue on those products rather than just sending them off to, for disposal. So in some cases, reverse logistics, has been seen to have a financial impact on the company's revenue or the bottom line. And this is because this is a model with the increasing use of technology and e-commerce in particular has to be looked at by companies which are basically businesses which are basically now in the gig economy. So businesses like, when you look at Facebook, Amazon, you look at businesses which provide, services, they have to have this particular concept of reverse logistics. And in some cases, customers are able to see, a return. When customers are returning the product, they're able to see, realization of revenue, which can even amount to up to 5%, even 5% of, the revenues which the company actually realizes. Let's look at now, after understanding some of the key terminology and concepts within, reverse logistics and the 5R model, let's look at digging into the reverse assessment criteria, which basically talks about how to look at the concepts of reverse logistics and what are its application in various industries. So here I've put together a few slides, which is primarily to understand why this is now an essential part of their strategy. In any company, when you look at especially the gig economy, reverse logistics is implemented as a strategy within the supply chain management by many companies, and they collect and reuse some parts of the goods which are basically sold or collected back from or returned back from customer. You will also see that in some cases, there are companies which have created a business model by the use of this particular concept of reverse logistics, and they are actually thriving, and their business model is actually based on the whole process of reverse logistics. Now, in order for the company to implement reverse logistics, the reasons behind why companies and organizations look at even considering this concept of reverse logistics would be that today there is pressure, or there is legal guidelines or regulation from legislation from the government in most countries that companies have to look at following. The other aspect would be environmental reasons in terms of the impact on the environment. And the third could be in terms of how do they maintain an overall or build, and how do they look at building reputation with customers in terms of ensuring that if something is to go wrong, they can then have the process of overall removing or replacing this product through the concept of reverse logistics. So in this particular concept and the SM criteria 2.1, we need to look at what is the 5R model of reverse logistics I've briefly explained, and this basically is implemented because it encompasses recapturing of any value which comes from the return product when the product is actually returned from the customer to the manufacturer. And before the manufacturer actually disposes of the product, because if it's faulty or a part has been replaced, they would then realize some sort of value by salvaging some of the raw material or the components of those products, which will allow them to realize some sort of margin or value in terms of the disposal of the item. Now, when we look at the 5 R's, I've created 5 slides in particular to look at discussing each of the R's, so that returns is quite clear. When we look at the process of return, this is the first step in the flow of reverse logistics when the customers decide to return a product or exchange a product because the product does not meet the guidelines or the expectations of the customer, or the description of the product sometimes is different from what has been supplied. So sometimes, as an example, I would say is all of us do shopping on eBay and Amazon, and when you buy something as a product and you find the description of the product given on the site before you place an order, and then when the product arrives, you find there's a discrepancy. So at some stage you decide, no, this is not something which I'm going to keep, I'm going to replace or exchange the product. And when that is to happen, what you generally see would be the case that the customer then initiates what's called a return. And in this case, the return tends to be, starting the first phase of this process, which is primarily called the return logistics. The second would be a recall. Now, we have seen in the past a number of news items sometimes which get covered, wherein you see that the automotive manufacturers have recalled the model. The car models have been recalled because of a faulty braking system or a faulty a transmission system. Now, in those cases, when those kind of recalls tend to happen, that also involves reverse logistics, because a car manufacturer like Toyota, which recalled over 80,000 models of Toyota Corolla in the US last year, there is they had to carefully consider the whole process of doing this recall. And in these recalls, they are diagnosed that one of the braking system, one of the components in the braking system was faulty, which could get jammed and could pose serious threat to the driver in this case and cause accidents. So in this case, when these kind of recalls happen, it can also lead to cases wherein the customer can sue the company because they've been sold a faulty product. But generally, the company, when they start the process of recalls, what they are looking at doing is making sure that the customer is able to deliver the product to the dealership. From the dealership, the necessary change of parts can happen, and once that happens, it removes the potential hazards. And in this case, then the product is delivered back to the customer. So recalls can just be simple recalls. They can also initiate what are called liability concerns, because in some cases, as I mentioned, customers can sue the company. And these concerns, if they are on a large scale or at a larger scale, is beyond one particular model, then sometimes you would generally see that the company also has repercussions in terms of fines which are imposed by various chartered bodies because it poses serious threats or hazards to the consumers while they're using the product. The third is repair, and I think we are quite at this point is self-explanatory. Sometimes when you look at the whole process of repairs, sometimes let's look at an example of high-tech devices like a smartphone. Typically, what will happen is if you've had a fault on the phone and it is under warranty, you would basically take it back to the manufacturer, or would ship it to the manufacturer. What they will do is, because it's a high-value item, they will look at repairing it first and diagnosing the fault. If the fault is diagnosed, they can repair it or replace that component. Then in those cases, they will repair and replace that component and then send it back to you. But the whole process of how this is handled is basically coming under repairs. In some cases, it is refurbishment. In some cases, if it's under warranty and it's happened within a couple of days, Apple, for example, sticking to what I've discussed with you earlier, if it happens within the first 14 days, the fault on the product, the company would basically take the product back and give you a new one. And in those cases, the product which has been returned, which is non-pristine, then would be sold off as a non-pristine product to realize some value. And if the product cannot be repaired, then in those cases, it's a serious fault which is coming across in a series of products with different customers in different locations, then it could be leading to a larger diagnosis in terms of ensuring that the company looks at doing an introspection to find out if it is a manufacturing fault, and does that need a serious look into in terms of product redesign. And that is where this process of repair can actually then open up into three different types of smaller processes like refurbishment, reuse, or remanufacturing. Repackaging, simple enough, and I think when I say simple enough, it's easy enough to understand, because in some cases when you look at remanufacturing, what you will generally see is that in these products, products would mean that the customer has to repackage or use packaging to be able to send this product back to the customer or the manufacturer. So in both cases, you would generally see that the repackaging of products is required, because you need to send it back in the original condition. Or if there are products which are fragile, then in those cases, these products have to be packaged well, so that during the process of transit or transportation, when reverse logistics is happening, that means the customer is returning the product, it still has the the product is able to go back to the manufacturer in a condition or condition in which the product is not breaking or it does not take damage. Last that we look at is basically recycling. In this case, recycling is coupled with the activity of disposal. That means you're disposing a product before before disposing it off, you're ensuring that it does not have any harmful material components and things like that, especially in the electronic products, wherein it can cause harm to the environment. So some of these products, when, say, for example, Apple disposes of old PCs or Macs, example, there's one of the promotions which Apple runs every year, which is called Back to School during September. And in this case, in these promotions, sometimes Apple introduces a concept wherein they say you can exchange your old MacBook or an iMac for a new one, and they give you some sort of a value for the old one. So depending on the condition of your iMac or the MacBook, they will give you a certain value, and that voucher or that value could then be attributed towards what you're buying as a new product. So in those cases, when we look at Apple products, because of the environmental compliance, the IEEE compliance on the electronics and high-end electronic products, there were certain chemicals up until the late 90s and early 2000s. Things like arsenic, mercury were still used in the screens. And before disposal of these products used to happen, the manufacturers were liable to ensure that these harmful chemicals are removed before these products are disposed. So in those cases, you will generally see that the company, before they look at recycling, they will look at a salvage operation in terms of taking out those products or components or raw material from the products which has some market value, and they would, collect and, for example, one of the key things that we look at when electronics is disposed of, there are companies which specialize in recovering rare earth elements or metals, which are metals like gold, silver, titanium, palladium, copper. They are salvaged from the products before they are disposed of, or they're sent off to say a crushing facility, or basically facility wherein these products will be then recycled, and then raw material from that recycled product will be used to create new products. So this concept of recycling and disposal goes hand in hand, and you would generally see that there are companies which have created business models in terms of just resalvaging this. So when you look at shipyards which are in Bangladesh, for example, a lot of old ships, they are sent to the shipyards in Bangladesh, wherein there's a large-scale recycling, disposal, and salvaging operation which happens, wherein the ships would be stripped down. But before they are stripped down, most of the reusable components are extracted from there, and then the final recycling of that happens in terms of melting the various components to release copper, iron ore, and other metals which can be reused for manufacturing by different different sectors in the market. Now, one of the last things that we look at when we understand the concept, so we need to understand the full circle. So we understood the 5R model, we understood why reverse logistics has become important. Now let's look at understanding where are the benefits of reverse logistics for manufacturers. So when we look at this, one of the key, one way of looking at this would be to look at understanding what are the benefits they get from a macro level when they follow this process or implement this process within the organization. One of them is basically looking at the company reducing waste, reducing its environmental impact in terms of, from a perspective of corporate social responsibility. And then in some cases, what they're looking at is they're also reducing some part of their bills, because if they're able to realize some value by reusing some of the materials which have been recovered from products which are being recycled and disposed of, they would basically look at making some money, and that will help them in reducing their bills, their pay. And last but not the least, what you'll also see that in some cases it is seen as a as a part of their responsibility, corporate social responsibility, under brand reputation, and also looking at customer experience, wherein the companies would look at taking this as a process to ensure that it reaches out to customers by ensuring that they are able to provide a better user experience. And in some cases, product recalls do happen, then it also helps them better manage reputation of the company when they utilize this process. Now, some of the examples which I mentioned earlier is obviously an example of Apple. You look at Damini Water, you look at H&M in the UK, when you look at clothes manufacturers in particular. So all these things are things that we look at in terms of reverse logistics, and a lot of companies, because there's a lot of money involved in reverse logistics, in order to shore up the bottom line. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the studies conducted by the Aberdeen study group clearly states from research is that companies realize up from anywhere between 9 to 15% of their revenues by following this process of reverse logistics. So any questions on this so far? Right, okay. So the second part of the assessment criteria is looking at expanding this into a bit further by looking into things like what are the issues and challenges which companies face if they suddenly have to look at starting and implementing this process of reverse logistics. So when we look at in particular this process, one of the slides which I want to actually show and talk about is this particular slide. It basically shows about the flow of services as it is defined in logistics process. Now, we refer and allude to the term called forward logistics and reverse logistics, so FL and RL. So forward logistics is nothing but when you see goods moving from manufacturer, producer to the customer. And reverse logistics or RL is when we look at the process of returns, repairs, recycling, anything which is moving backwards from the customer onwards to either a supplier, producer, or a manufacturer. So in some cases, this diagram basically depicts that flow. So when we look at suppliers actually supplying goods and services to factories which will manufacture the finished product, they are actually forward supplying, because that process is basically a forward supply process. So in this case, the best thing would be to look at defining this, some of the activities on this diagram. We can generally see that it is being defined as FLO, forward logistics. So from the warehouse onwards to the distributor, retailer, in this case also, it is basically forward logistics. So when we look at differentiating what are the various, areas or places, when logistics happens the flow of logistics happens, we look at defining this as FL and RL, so forward and reverse. So reverse would mean customers actually sending the defective products back to the warehouse, to the distribution center, or returning them to the retailer, and from there the retailer actually doing a bit of testing or screening, returning the product back to their repair center, and repair center then, if not able to repair that, then they will basically look at pushing it back to the manufacturer, and that is where this flow becomes reverse. That means it is going from customer backwards to the supplier, to the transporter, warehouse, distributor, and then finally to the manufacturer. Now, when we look at this in particular, there are a couple of reasons that we look at which would be challenges, issues or challenges as we call them, which the customers and manufacturers face. Both of them actually face. So let's look at these challenges from a point of view of manufacturer and producer, because we are looking at studying reverse logistics. Now, sometimes when you look at companies creating, like there are lots of .com companies or gig economy companies which are coming up, which are setting up internet businesses now, and they set up internet shops to be able to sell products. But when you sell those products, you do not know how many of these will end up in being returns. That means if the customer changes their mind or these products have to be returned back, how would you know that, how much of what you're selling could actually come back to you because the product has not been liked, is faulty, the description is not accurate, things like that. So forecasting is one of the factors, is one of the key challenges or factors that we look at in the case of reverse logistics. So if you produce a certain amount of goods, today a certain amount of goods, manufacturer would demand from its supplier that we need a certain buffer to be able to maintain replacement, repairs, and the ability to be able to offer these replacements because of the process of reverse logistics, because they cannot predict how much of this will be faulty, how much of this will be returned because the customer has changed his mind and things like that. The other bit which is a bit challenging, but it is improving with the implementation of technology, is that the tracking of defectives is, sometimes difficult. There are smaller businesses which still do this on a manual basis, but obviously because it's done manually, sometimes you would see that in retail stores or shops or large warehouses, there is a percentage of defective or repaired goods which do not get sold, and at the end of the day or at the end of the year, they have to be written off as inventory which is not sold. So tracking of defectives, if it's not done electronically, poses a big challenge for small and even in large businesses. An example of this we will look at towards the end when you look at Amazon and how they follow the process of returns. Everything is electronically tagged, it's RFID tagged, so that they try to minimize any losses which could happen because the inventory or the product which has been returned from the customer has not been tracked and is lying somewhere in the warehouse. Then there are challenges which could happen primarily because of transit losses, damages which could happen in terms of improper packaging which has been done on the product, or the product when it has been shipped from the customer has been, has not been transported properly or packaged properly, and that leads to a damage on the product, which means it is beyond repair. It cannot be resold, or it in this case has to be written off. Then in the case of clothes manufacturers, when we look at retailers in particular, there is a lot of times you would see a term which has come out now, and it is a proper term which is used in the industry, is customer-induced damage, CID. Now this tends to be when customers tend to don't like the product, and the only way they can return the product is by showing that the product is damaged. So sometimes this is called the customer-induced damage, And this is also something which cannot be predicted, because if you look at a cloth, for example, and you've worn that cloth once, but the cloth has got a bit of a torn, or has got a bit of a scratch, or has got a bit of a spot on it, there is no way that you can ascertain that this has been done either at customers end or at the outlets end before it was sold. So in some cases, some law and legislation is now incorporated in when you buy the goods, the sale and purchase of goods happens. There are some terms and conditions which manufacturers, retailers, wholesalers put into in the invoicing, so that they can reduce the customer-induced damage. Now, there are other points and challenges that we look at. Sometimes when the products have been received, if the repair and the people who look into the product for replacement and repair of these products do not look at it carefully, or if they are insufficiently trained in terms of the screening process to identify the problems, that could also mean that the customer, the specialist would say, no, this cannot be repaired. The hard drive is faulty, for example, in the laptop, without having to reformat or reset it. And then that would mean that the hard drive has to be changed, which is an add-on cost to the manufacturer or the supplier in this case. And obviously, when we look at large-scale returns, as in a large business like Amazon, which has millions and millions of SKUs that they sell on a daily basis to billions of customers worldwide, they have to have an allocation or a central warehousing in which they are able to have these returns allocated, collected, compiled, from which they are able to quickly sift through and see what can be returned, what can be replaced, what can be salvaged, what has to be going to the landfill, or is basically should be disposed of. And in those cases, storage also tends to be a cost which the company to look into when they consider sort of reverse logistics. Now, various studies which have happened, and these studies have basically zeroed in on certain points in terms of what are the indicators that the business actually needs to look at implementing this process. So these indicators tend to be if the business is having a lot of returns. That means if you're a clothing business on eBay or you're a business on Amazon and you're selling products, yes, if you sell 100 products but 50% or 30%, I'm just making this up as a percentage, but assuming you are getting 30%, 40% returns, that means the volume of returns is quite high, and that is where you need to start planning this process of implementing reverse logistics in the organization. Now, if you're dealing with products as a seller or as a producer, products which have high value and can be returned because of the condition and type of the product or the sector in which they are sold, then in those cases also you have to look at considering the process of reverse logistics. If it's high value items and these high value items cannot be disposed of or cannot be repaired, then in this case you have to look at the value of the items, and in those cases you'll also put this process of reverse logistics in place. I'll give you an example of Louis Vuitton. Now, Louis Vuitton every year, and some of these large brands like Burberry, Mulberry, Louis Vuitton, they basically create a lot of clothing lines. Now, if the production has over forecasted and they produce this as a product, then at some stage what they do is they put out a sale from a retailer's point to sell these products off. But if these products are not sold off, I think Louis Vuitton last year was in the news when they decided to, the unsold inventory, rather than dispose it off or, basically sell it off at a cheaper price, because they felt that it will degrade their reputation, bring the pricing of the products down, and, let's say, dilute the value of their brand. They decided to burn their products rather than to sell them off or dispose them off at a cheaper price. And they were in the news for the wrong reason, saying that inventory worth $160 million worth was actually destroyed rather than having that distributed, because they feared that it would damage or dilute their brand and their reputation and bring the prices down. So rather than sell it off on a sale, they decided to do and take this major step. So companies will have to look at the process of reverse logistics if the products are very expensive, and in some cases, if they cannot salvage the value by selling it on offers, promotions, and things like that, they will have to consider building this process in to ensure that if we sell, say, 200 bags, but 2 bags have to be looked at as a buffer, because that would require repair, replacement, faulty products or things like that, and that would be non-acceptable to the customer because they are beyond repair. Percentage of sale, a lot of companies put it on the basis of percentage of sale. 1% of their sale, 0.1% of their sale, is something which they would incur as costs or other things that would keep aside as buffer, primarily for the process of implementing reverse logistics. And in some cases, when you look at, there are lots of resources that you have to put in, not just physical infrastructure, time, money, cost resources, but resources in terms of human resources, because at the end of the day, all this is to be dealt by a human. It cannot be all machine driven. So in some cases, when you look at this, these are some of the 5 main reasons why companies look at the process of reverse logistics, because if they see returns happening, the product value depreciating, or the value of products produced is very high in some cases because of the condition and the nature of the products being sold, because of legislation in some countries, consumer laws in some countries. These all are factors which kind of, persuade the companies or organizations to put the process of, or implement the process of reverse logistics in the organization. Now, let's briefly look at how come these challenges are overcome. So when we look at these challenges, a lot of companies put in a lot of, processes in place in order for them to come up and overcome these issues or problems or challenges. So one such thing that the companies look at is they design the whole system, wherein when they're designing the logistics system in general, they will also consider this process of reverse logistics within that system. So that means if anything is to be designed, they will design things from a point of view of forward logistics and reverse logistics, and at some stage look at building this and implementing this within the organization. The second thing which they look at is turnaround times, or TAT. Now, turnaround times are calculated in different sectors on the basis of, how long does it take for the return to come from the customer to the manufacturer? What are the guidelines? Sometimes when you buy products on Amazon, going back to the example again, Amazon allows up to 60 days for you to be able to return the product. That means the value, the company which has sold the product on Amazon does not actually realize the value of those goods being sold for up to 60 days. So the payments to the manufacturers, in some cases, when you look at PayPal providing you, buyer protection as an option, that means if you buy a product, you have still 30 days to be able to, return that product, and PayPal would still refund that money and not pay the retailer. So those are things which have to be looked into when companies actually look at overcoming these challenges by considering something called turnaround times. Now, other challenges is use of technology, reduce manual handling, basically when I say manual handling means it is to look at manual data being entered into or records being maintained, everything to be done electronically using technology so that they are, tagged, it can be recovered, replaced, and it can be tracked within the system, whether it's in the warehouse, in transportation, at the supplier's end, or, under transit in transit to the customer. So when we look at some of these, solutions which manufacturers and organizations have to put in place, this will then allow them to look at overcoming some of these challenges. Now, because in this particular task we have to look at understanding these challenges in a bit more detail, what I've done in on the Moodle is primarily uploaded a couple of case studies and handouts, which I would suggest that you should read and look into, and they are basically available under the unit, and I've labeled them to reflect the particular learning outcome and the assessment criteria that you need to look at. So there is an infographics that I'm going to show you, which primarily is for UPS, which talks about the 5-step process that they've put into place to handling reverse logistics. There are some issues and a case study which I've put in. It's a synopsis of a couple of pages which explains the the issues which companies face and why they look at reverse logistics. There are some sector related case studies which I've put in, which is for electronics industry in Thailand, and then I put in another one which is for automotive industry, because what we need to be able to do is in this particular assessment criteria look at different sectors and look at different challenges which different types of organizations in these sectors face, and why do they look at the process of implementing, reverse logistics. So if I just open up a graphic, offline, which I was mentioning to you because I've got it on Moodle, but I'm going to try and open it here, which basically would give you a clear idea in terms of, how this, has been implemented by, UPS. So there's some additional reading, which is basically what I'm suggesting to crystallize some of the discussion and the concepts that I've explained here, which I would suggest that you need to look at, from a point of view of understanding the reverse logistics and the challenges which is primarily faced, by companies in implementing these reverse logistics, cases. So let me just look at showing you the infographic which I was mentioning, and that is where this infographic is. So this is quite a large image. It is stored as an infographic, and it gives you pictorially the process which UPS follows in terms of the 5R model when it basically incorporated this process within its organization. So it basically tells you at every stage, what are the kind of products they're shipping, returning, repackaging, how much of value, and this is a good synopsis of the 5R model, which essentially makes you understand, the whole process of the reverse logistics working within an organization. So these two additional reading along with the infographics of the reverse logistics will help you cover 2.2 in detail. Now let's very briefly look at the whole aspect of how this process is implemented within an organization. So when we look at the basic dimensions of logistics, why do you think the whole process of reverse logistics starts? So we look at the 4 W's, why, when, what, where, how, who. So if we answer these 5 questions in terms of who's returning, why they are returning, what is being returned, and what kind of, say for example, what kind of, say, I'll use the word, what kind of, say, repair, replacement would actually be implemented in this case for the product to go back to the customer. So when we look at this basic dimension of, RL or reverse logistics, this particular model of reverse logistics was proposed by D. Brito in early 2004, and what it said was there are 5 dimensions to which this process conforms to, and these 5 dimensions then are related to the 5R model, which we have looked at in the initial beginning in terms of the slides. Now, there are different perspectives by different, research authors and, people who have done research on this particular process, and they have suggested a particular methodology in terms of how this process actually flows. So when we looked at this particular image earlier of logistics, so we kind of, differentiated between the different activities of what is forward moving and what is reverse moving by using the terminology FL and RL. So at some stage, what we want to be able to do is that we want to see that this reverse logistics process, how does it work? So this kind of a flow, which has been created, by the
go on top with the messages on.
So when we look at this particular flow, what we do see is that this is the flow which a company would need to implement when we look at inputs to outputs, and in between the processing happening either to create a finished product or when the input of raw material happens, there's some processes which are run, and then finally it leads to the creation of a finished product. So when we look at that, this is the particular flow which the companies at some stage would have to implement when they look at the process of reverse logistics. So this is the theoretical understanding. What we want to do is understand what are the basic impacts of implementing this process and how can this be implemented within a particular industry or a sector. Now, I put in a bit of a slide to differentiate between what is forward logistics and reverse logistics, and this helps beautifully recap the challenges or the steps involved in terms of challenges or basically issues and problems involved in the case of forward logistics and reverse logistics, because this is key to understanding what kind of a flow would the company look at, and where they would classify each of these factors to say, this is something which is a reverse process, this is something which is a forward process, and because of which they will arrive at a solution to then start implementing this process because of various reasons that we discussed. Things like returns rates are quite high, the value of the product, high value of order of the product, and customers looking at really in this case the 5 points that we looked at, we discussed. So volume of returns, we look at the type and condition of the products being manufactured, what is the value of products being manufactured, what percentage of sales and the return on products is happening, and then last, what are the resources which are required to handle this process in terms of reverse logistics. Now, when we look at this particular table, I'm not going to go into detail, but the points are quite self-explanatory. Here it talks about, and we look at this through an example of Amazon towards the end of this session, in a couple of minutes. What we want to do is understand what we are discussing in the aspect of 2.3 by looking at a particular video of how Amazon handles the whole process of reverse logistics. So when we look at this, we looked at touching on some of the points like there is what are the challenges which the process provides to organizations, and these challenges tend to be around forecasting. You don't know how much of products would be coming back as returns because of being faulty, the customers changing their mind because of legislation which allows the customer to change its mind within 14 days of the purchase of the product, and some of those factors. So those are recapped here when we look at the FL and RLS processes. Now, when we look at some of the reasons why companies would implement, we can go back to what we covered in the key terminology. There could be three main reasons. One is legislation. Second could be environmental responsibility. And the third could be the strategies which are related to helping build the brand which the companies have in front of the customer in order to integrate and provide a holistic consumer experience or customer experience of the product. And last but not the least, looking at relating it to their corporate image or reputation, which means that the company looks at going the full circle, wherein if you buy a product, if the product turns out to be faulty or not meets your expectation or is not as per the description, the company is able to take the product back, either offer a replacement or a repair, and the 5R process is then implemented in guidelines with relation to the reputation and the corporate image of the company. So these tend to be the basic reasons of why environment, we look at costs, we look at reputation and legislation, which tend to be the broader reasons of why companies now have started to look into this concept of RL or reverse logistics. Now, if we go into a bit more detail, because the third ask is asking us to analyze. In analysis, what you have to do is put together a lot of arguments, supported with so a lot of points which you have to support with arguments in order to show analysis. Now, when we look at this particular aspect of why organizations pick up or implement the process of reverse logistics, we also look at certain studies which have been done. And one of the studies which has been put forward by the Council of Logistics Management, CLM, in the 90s was that companies, there are three types of companies or organizations when they look at environmental responsibility. They either have a reactive attitude, they have a proactive attitude, or they have a value search attitude. So these were defined as, reactive is quite self-explanatory because it says the companies, before they sell any sort of a product in the market, have to comply with legislation. And that is where this tends to be a bit of a reactive attitude, because before they can sell the product in the market, like for example, when you look at electronic products, they have to have a compliance with IEEE, the electrical standards and other bits in different countries or different geographies. They have to meet the compliance, and that is why it is reactive. When we look at proactive, now in this case, the companies are looking at going a further mile or beyond a certain stage wherein they are trying to build reputation, connection with the customer, provide a holistic customer experience, and they are beginning to realize their responsibilities towards the environment. So in conjunction with legislation, they also look at having a bit of morality to manage the products and services that they are producing, and look at the concept of environmental responsibility. So in this case, they are looking at creating products which utilize raw material, but the utilization of raw material actually helps them either increase yield and in tandem look at some sort of a collective responsibility towards the environment. The third one tends to be what is called the value search attitude, and in this case, what they are looking at is in certain products and services that they are basically introducing or selling in the market, the companies would tend to add value to those products by creating some sort of a responsibility. Like one of the things that we look at as a basic example now is that the companies which are producing batteries, when we look at Duracell, a lot of different companies like Eveready, what they do is they've installed containers within large warehouses or retail stores or shops. When they say if you're buying a battery, they're actually asking you to dispose of the old batteries or worn-out batteries in that container so that it is helping them recycle and build a bit of ethical responsibility by offering this value in terms of selling that product. Because what they're also looking at doing is they're trying to realize some sort of a value from recycling as an operation and also relating it to the ethical responsibility towards society, saying that these are rare metals or elements which are which have to be disposed of in a safe way so that they do not pollute the environment or cause any adverse effect. So in this case, what you're looking at is the organizations looking at doing or adopting what is called the value search attitude, wherein they are trying to link it to corporate social responsibility, but at the same time also trying to dispose of some of these products which they produce by offering incentives to consumers in some cases, or in some cases, realizing disposable value by when they use when they actually utilize the process of disposal or recycling in order to do away with that product. So these benefits, are key to the fact that they are, if a company looks at implementing the process of RL within their production and manufacturing facilities, at some stage they are looking at realizing some sort of a commercial value out of it, and that commercial value that they're looking at realizing actually comes in from the different types of attitude the company has as per the Council of Logistics Management in terms of coming out with that particular framework or the three different types of attitudes which the companies can exhibit. Now, apart from that, we are looking at maybe one of the other arguments could be that when companies look at economic benefits, they are looking at realizing some part of it from what they are recycling. When we look at the concept of waste management and waste management logistics, in those cases, the companies are looking at deriving some sort of a value which could be, reverse engineered before the product is disposed of, and it helps them realize some sort of a, let's say, margin or value from the product. An example here would be, say, for example, when you look at a lot of businesses which are created on the concept of reverse logistics. In developing countries, you would see a lot of businesses which basically recycle old goods. So a lot of IT from the Western world is going to developing countries wherein these goods are being recycled before they are actually disposed of, or So recycling means they're taking out the useful material, whether it's copper, iron ore, any sort of rare earth metals which are being removed from these, and then this material is being used to reprocess and recreate newer materials or newer products. And in those cases, because there are some restrictions, or let's say environmental restrictions in developed countries, that is where the export of these goods is happening to developing countries wherein either the standards or the legislations are not there, or in some cases the environmental restrictions are not there. So this helps this is basically an economic point wherein there is some value being created in economies by exporting of these goods to developing countries, wherein this then allows certain ancillary industries and businesses to be created, which will then realize value or economic value from the concept of recycling, or one of the components of the 5R model, recycling and disposal before the finished or the final product is actually disposed of and used for creating basically integrating into raw material for creating new products. So they tend to be environmental restrictions. It could be realizing costs or cost reductions. So when you look at old shipping containers, freight containers being sold off to Bangladesh, wherein in the shipping yard they are salvaged for iron ore, metals, and other products, there is some sort of a cost which gets associated, but that cost is realized when you sell that off or a company sells that off. So for them, they will write off that inventory by realizing some cost into their balance sheet, but at the other end, it will create jobs and employment, and also this process creates economic value. It could be competitive reasons. It could also be differentiation in terms of corporate image. That when you look at large companies like Unilever, Nestle, Kraft, they are integrating this. They have already integrated this as a process into their manufacturing because they seem to be able to relate this to their corporate social responsibility, and because of which it is related directly to their reputation and the image of the company. So an important concept in terms of how reverse logistics as a process is implemented or put into practice within the companies or within organizations is actually covered here. On Moodle, what I've done is I've put two handouts in particular which primarily give you some additional reading in terms of understanding that what reasons why companies implement this as a process within the organization, or organizations within their processes would do that, and they're nicely covered, and some part of that has been used to make this particular presentation as well. If you want to look at more details, these are the helps that I would suggest that you need to read in order to do your assessment as well, because the last criteria talks about the implementation of these in different business sectors. So I put one electronics industry example, and the other one which is the automotive industry example, which will nicely fit in for you to be able to do the assessment, when you look at attempting the assignment. So any questions on this so far? Right. There is a video that I want to show, but I'm going to try and put a link of this in the slides because this is a slightly longish video which basically shows this whole concept of how reverse logistics actually works with a company like Amazon. So I'm going to try and put this video on these slides for you to look at rather than play it here because it's a 16-minute long video. But you watch this video, it will give you a full, it will cover all the points that we have discussed today, from the point of view of understanding the concept, why companies need to implement it, what are the challenges they face in implementing this as a process, and what is the business impact that RL has on a company's bottom line. So this is all covered.
Millions of dollars in unwanted.
This is all covered in this one particular video, which nicely explains the concept. And I would suggest that when you look at doing a revision or revisiting this presentation and the recording, my suggestion would be to look at watching this video first and then reading the slide, because it will help you correlate all the things that I've covered in today's presentation and the discussion with the which shows Amazon as an example of a company which is which basically as a company is such a vital process in its business model that without this concept being applied, there will be a lot of will face a gaping hole in its profit if they don't apply this process within their business model. Okay. So any questions at this stage for me on this session?